Welcome to What Do You Want to Do? The show that will hopefully help you figure out what you want to do in life or reconnect you to what you love doing. Each show has a guest who is doing what they love to do, whether it's in their career or in addition to their regular job. Most importantly, we want to help you realize that no matter your age, you too can do what you want to do if you have the will to do it. Now here's your host, Leonard Caplan.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to What Do You Want to Do? This is part 2 of our interview with Pell Osborn, and he talks about all kinds of interesting animation history with us and the best careers in animation that you might want to work for. So thanks again for joining us, and keep watching. Let's talk about some of the categories of animation. There's claymation, and there's the type that you do. There's CGI.
Right.
When you're faced with a project, you have to make a decision what type of animation is going to fit this project and what is feasible for you to do with a limited budget. How do you guide us through that decision-making process?
Okay, great. I'll do my best. First part of your question, what are the different types of animation? I guess there are as many types of animation as you can think of, basically, but I think of them as about 4 different types. You mentioned CGI. A lot of people are confused by that. It stands for computer-generated imagery, and it's a fancy way of saying computer animation. That's one type. Stop-motion animation, if you're familiar with the Wallace and Gromit animations, that's stop-motion where you're posing a puppet, a little tiny bit of a change between exposures, and then the puppet itself appears to move. The original King Kong from 1933 was accomplished with stop-motion animation. Pixelation is one of my favorite types, and that's actually one of the easier forms of animation. Basically, the camera does all the work. It makes one exposure every certain interval of time. If you want to stretch it out, one exposure every minute or one exposure every 5 seconds, you can reposition yourself in front of the camera. It's a little bit like stop motion, but you're not using puppets or posing things. You're generally posing people, or you're enjoying floating clouds that move by at the speed of a waterfall, what we call time lapse. That's all pixelated animation or interval animation. And then, of course, there's the hand-drawn kind of animation, and there are many varieties of that. You can actually scratch on film with a razor blade and make all kinds of crazy marks that appear to dance to the music or whatever your soundtrack might be. There's careful hand-drawn animation actually using, golly, paper and a pen. And as I mentioned before, that's what I like to do, about 10 drawings per second. The old Disney stuff from the 1930s and 40s and 50s was generally done at about 12 drawings per second. So they got really smooth motion, and it just looks great. I have yet to see something as beautiful as the final 10 minutes of Pinocchio, this unbelievable chase when Monstro the whale is after our heroes. And every single thing in every single frame is in motion all the time, and it's 12 drawings per second. And it's just like, wow, how did they keep track of all that stuff? And they had no computers whatsoever back in the late 1930s, early 40s when they were making Pinocchio. So how do I decide which of these to use to fit a particular project? Every animator and every commercial animator, I should say, and every commercial animation house, that is to say a professional animation studio, puts together what they call a show reel or a sizzle reel or some captivating example of all the different projects that they've done. And that often uses many different types of animation in the case of animators. And I really have trouble with deadlines, and the older I get, the worse it seems to be. So partly one of the ways I battled that issue was to get deeper and deeper into using animation as a wonderful tool for education, because I can keep up with the educator's deadline. I know how that works. I've been to school and I've been to college and I've taught in both places. And it's a whole lot easier in many ways than in the commercial world, where animation studios can be unbelievably stressed some executive at some advertising agency gets an idea and says, hey, we need this by Monday. And you get the word that they need it by Monday on Thursday afternoon. And it's like, maybe it's a long weekend coming up. And the last thing you want to do is like spend your weekend trying to work out a particular plan for somebody's very complex animation spot or advertisement that you really don't know what it's going to look like. They really only know what they don't want it to look like. And it can get very frustrating. I don't mean to be down on that. Obviously, it's one of my own personal sore points. It's very, very hard in the commercial animation world to survive these constant deadlines. And that's one of the reasons that I turned to education late in my career. You were very sweet at the beginning of our chat, Len, to mention that I had done specific pieces for American Airlines, Continental Cablevision, Sears, Roebuck and Company. Do they even still exist? I can't remember.
They do. They're hanging on.
They're hanging in there, right? But yeah, those were all connections that I made through the Harvard University Carpenter Center, the School for the Visual Arts, where I was involved in animation. And I actually taught several seminars there as well as at MIT. So it's been a very interesting career for me, but at the same time, I have to confess, I really did not relish the commercial aspects of commercial animation. And they're daunting. One of my colleagues once put it best. He said, to make a Pixar animation project is a daunting technological endeavor. And it really is. Many people are involved for up to 5 years on a single animated feature.
Right.
The core team that worked on Up, that wonderful Pixar story of the older gentleman whose house floats away on a great cloud of balloons, they were involved on that show for 5.5, 6 years. And I tell many of my students in elementary school that they began working on Monsters Incorporated before you were born, and they were still working on it by the time you were 5 years old. So it's a really, it's a very complex thing to do when you're building all this material frame by frame.
So working the way you have been doing, pretty much in control of everything, it would be kind of hard for you probably to be in a staff of 500 or 1,000 people on a major animated feature.
Yes, it would be. Although I have all kinds of respect for people who are able to do that. I mean, when you're on a staff working on some huge feature, much of what you do is actually not so much your own work as it is conforming your work to look like other work. And in addition to these storyboards, the commercial animation studios have these big sheets that they call model drawing sheets to show how a character looks from all different angles. And that's very important to keep the character consistent from one animator to the next, whether you're doing it as a computer-generated character or a hand-drawn character. So the model sheet is really important. And if you want to see some very cool things, just Google the phrase animation model sheet sometime, and you'll come up with all kinds of great images that the commercial studios put together to create these characters consistently.
Sounds interesting. What is your favorite period of animation history and why? We have the pre-Disney Gertie the Dinosaur stuff.
Yeah.
We've got the early Disney with Oob Iwerks and
Right.
him collaborating on Mickey Mouse. And then they went to color. I think it was in 1932.
That's
and then you
about
get
right. The flowers and the trees.
Right. And then you get the Dave Fleischer
Max and Dave,
movies.
right?
So there's a lot to choose from. So
Sure.
what's your preference?
Well, my preference is the early 30s to the early to mid 40s. The early 30s, there was still an amazing amount of experimentation going on, and it was just so hilarious and exciting, all the crazy stuff that the Fleischer brothers did before they did things that we're used to, like Popeye and Betty Boop. They
Right.
did a whole lot of crazy, wonderful shorts. One of my favorites, I believe it's called just the word PEP, P-E-P,
Huh.
and has to do with a dentist's office where the anesthesia, the laughing gas hose somehow gets dropped out the window, and all of New York City turns into this crazy metropolis. Bridges are lifting up and laughing, and it's just wonderfully loose and crazy animation. And many of those Betty Boop cartoons from the early 30s are full of extraordinary invention. Max and Dave tried anything. They were from New York City and very creative and resourceful. And they actually did a really cool movie, a silent animation on Albert Einstein's general law of relativity, his theory of relativity.
No kidding.
Which is really cool. It's very, very interesting. You can look that up on YouTube as well. And it's a silent, but just beautifully animated.
They pushed the boundaries as well with The Old Man of the Mountain. Remember that one?
Yes, and they also did the wonderful Bouncing Ball series of animation.
Yes.
They also did the most expensive series at the time, which were the hand-drawn Max Fleischer Superman animations. Just extraordinarily detailed and wonderfully rendered animations, each about 7 to 8 minutes long, from the Superman comic books of the 1930s. And they're brilliantly colored and brilliantly paced, and the music is great, and what can I say, the animation is as good as anything Disney ever did. Sure. Speaking of which, the Disney stuff from the 1930s is equally inventive and just wonderfully fun. But at the same time, I get the sense that Disney was such a sort of businessman at the same time that he was a very imaginative, fabulous storyteller. He really wanted to make things work, and he plowed a lot of his money back into experimenting and improving the animation. And very few studios were doing that at the time. So his research and development work was almost as important as the commercial stuff that they created at Disney's. The chap who made Gertie the Dinosaur had the first technical studio, Winsor McCay, way back in 1908 to 1910. And Winsor McCay did some really bizarre and wonderful things, like one of my favorites is How a Mosquito Operates. Which
very
is
interesting.
An animated nature film on how a mosquito bites you. So pretty crazy. And he, of course, also did the amazing vaudeville act, because he took it to theaters, live action theaters, where you project Gertie the Dinosaur on a screen, and then he would gesture to the screen and make Gertie react to his gestures. Of course, he knew exactly what the timing was, so the film of Gertie was already animated and pre-built. Winsor McCay would have a pianist or an organist in the theater pit who play the music, and then Winsor McCay would announce through a microphone that he wanted Gertie to dance, or Gertie to eat a tree, or whatever Gertie the dinosaur might do. And at the very end, he goes behind the stage and appears to run up onto Gertie's back and rides off waving his top hat. But of course, he's animated in that case as well. But apparently this just brought the house down. People had never seen anything like this. And it must have been exhausting, because he'd do this 3 or 4 times a day, and each time to great acclaim.
Now, who is responsible for the very first animated sound short? Was it Steamboat Willie by Disney, or was it the Fleischer Brothers?
Wow, I'm really impressed, Len. You've done some really good homework here. As far as I'm concerned, I believe it was Steamboat Willie, 1927. And they actually had animated something called the Galloping Gaucho to sound before that, but Steamboat Willie was released first. And Galloping Gaucho and Steamboat Willie were both Disney shorts.
Interesting.
Steamboat Willie, of course, gets its name from a very famous Buster Keaton silent comedy from the same era called Steamboat Bill. And anyone who was alive at the time, the late 1920s, would certainly have been aware of that play on the name Steamboat Willie.
I am a fan of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd. And the reason I know all this stuff is because in my drama classes, I used to teach the history of silent films.
So excellent. So great to know. Wow.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
One of the things that I love about what they're doing at Pixar and occasionally at DreamWorks is, now that they have these amazing tools to produce animation of such a high caliber. They're going back and looking at those early animations to see how they worked, why they were so appealing and so much fun. And there was a recent Disney piece called How to Ride a Horse, in which Mickey and Goofy and Peg Leg Pete, the horrible sort of fat, goofy character with the peg leg, always the bad guy, they get into a tremendous tussle behind the movie screen in a theater. And
wow.
they go in and out of the screen in 3D, in black and white, in silent, in sound. And it's just a crazy sort of review of animation technology from the earliest days up until 2010, when this short was created.
Fantastic history. And you've had a fantastic career. I want you to speak to the people who might be listening or watching. How do you recommend them getting into animation? If so, what aspect of it? Can you make a living doing that in 2020 beginning?
Yeah, you definitely can make a living doing it, but you have to be careful. 2020, of course, is the pandemic year, so everybody has to be careful about everything. But I think one of the things the pandemic is making everyone do is hunker down and reassess what they really want to do and how successfully they can do it. And working from home is a really smart way to do animation these days. You can always link up with somebody else via the internet or via Zoom, which is the way Len and I are communicating right now. I spoke to Len's TV class a couple of months ago about looking for opportunities in animation, not necessarily in the standard places you might assume. Like, don't look just at an animation studio, but look at an architecture firm. They're always looking for people to draw up quick plans or make suggestions about design. Also in animation studios, many of them, like DreamWorks and Pixar, they got their own architecture departments because they're designing buildings and landscapes and cityscapes for their stories to act in. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Lawson animated birthday cards that you can get on the internet. You often get those things, whether you want them or not, in your email. And some of those are tremendously creative, but wow, what a great way. I mean, if you're interested in the animated image, what a great way to sell your stuff. Everybody's got a birthday every year, and there are 375 million Americans with birthdays every year. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Yeah, I would say try to look for the unusual in opportunities.
The untraveled road.
Thank you. It could be right under your nose or right under your foot, but you have to step out and start walking down it. It's interesting you would ask me this, Len. In many ways, my career is sort of slowing down. I turned 72 years old last month, which
Congratulations.
is Thank you. And
you don't seem it.
Well, that's sweet of you to say. I enjoy a lot of the things that I'm doing. I haven't taught a whole lot in the last couple of months. Nobody has done a whole lot, if you ask me. And it's quite discouraging that way. But I'm working on an animated interpretation of a song by the Benny Goodman Sextet. And I enter personal animations from time to time in film festivals, which is a great place for people to see your work. And I'm always hip, or hope to be hip, about the latest, coolest things to watch. And I share them with friends, and they share them with me too. So to live in the era of YouTube and Vimeo is an unbelievable gift for a child from the early 1950s who grew up hoping there would be an animation on the Disneyland TV show once a week or once a month. So it's a pretty amazing time. This is a really, truly golden age of animation. And it's a great time to be an animator.
Well, that's a really good thing to hear, because, you know, you think of CGI, the average person, there's no room for anything else, and it's all computers, and people are going to be put aside. I saw a thing the other day on the internet. It was a Facebook ad. No, it was an Instagram ad for artificial voiceovers. Like
Wow.
the computer will generate, and they played them, and they were frighteningly close to the human voice,
The
more
actual,
so than anything else. Which, of course, I do a little bit of voiceover stuff on the side,
yeah, and you
and
do great voiceovers.
I don't like that. I don't want that to happen. But
Right.
you can't. But I think there'll always be room for the human touch. I think in voiceovers or animation or any kind of artwork.
Yeah, I think so too. I mentioned to your students last month, and it's still true, because of the slowness. I mean, even with tremendous computer power, it takes a lot of time to generate material. And one of the things I'm always fascinated by is the actual amount of man hours that go into making one of these animation features. And someone computed that if Walt Disney himself had done all the work, all the drawing, all the painting, all the photography of every single piece of art in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first Disney feature released in 1937, it would have taken him 237 years to do that. And that's why, an army of 1,200 people worked on that. And when you divide 237 years by 1,200 people, it comes out to pretty close to 5 years or so. But the really amazing thing is, even with all the computer power, the amazing computer power that they used on Toy Story or on the latest Pixar Disney film Onward, it took them about 85 years of computing time to render and put together these huge features. So it's a very slow process, and it's daunting, and it's, we're always looking for shortcuts. So I always hope that when you're doing the shortcut, you come up with something that's as interesting as it would have been if you weren't doing the shortcut, because the fun of animation is how it moves. It doesn't matter what's actually moving, but wow, if it moves in an intriguing and engaging way, that's just the greatest. So keep the movement alive.
That's a great note to end on. And Pell Osborn, thank you for joining us here on What Do You Want to Do? And I hope to have you back
at some point. Great, Len. If you need a little animation for an opening or closing for the inaugural episode of What Do You Want to Do, let us know. We could try to come up with something neat and fleet.
Thanks for joining us again here on What Do You Want to Do? Next week, we'll have another guest who I won't name right now, so you'll have to tune in and find out. And until then, what do you want to do?